You're mid-sentence. You're not even saying anything important. You're literally just saying, "Who's a good boy? Are you hungry? Do you want to go for a walk?" Completely mundane words you've said 1,000 times before. And your dog, who has heard this exact tone of voice, this exact pitch, this exact rhythm more times than either of you could count, suddenly cocks its head to one side like you just said, something in a language it's never encountered. Ears perked, eyes locked on your face, head tilted at that specific angle that makes your chest ache a little bit every single time. And here's the thing, nobody actually stops to ask, why? Why does a sound your dog has heard 10,000 times before suddenly trigger that reaction? Why not every time? Why that particular angle? Why does it feel every single time like your dog is trying so hard to understand you that it's physically rearranging its own skull to do it? Because that's basically what's happening. Not the skull part, obviously, but the trying part. That's real. And once you understand what's actually going on inside a dog's head when it does this, you will never look at it the same way again. Let's go. Start with the thing most people assume, because it's wrong and it's worth clearing up first. Most people think the head tilt is just cuteness, an accident of anatomy, a side effect of floppy ears or big eyes that happens to look adorable and serves no actual function. That's not true, not even close. The head tilt is a functional behavior. It is your dog actively doing something, solving a problem in real time, and the problem is sound. Here's the first layer, and it's the one that gets talked about the least, even though it's probably the most important. Dogs have muzzles. You have a flat face, relatively speaking, with your ears sitting on either side of it at roughly the same distance from your eyes and mouth. A dog's muzzle sticks straight out in front of its face, and that changes everything about how sound reaches its ears. Researchers who study animal hearing have pointed out that a long muzzle can actually interfere with a dog's ability to visually locate the source of a sound, because the muzzle itself blocks part of the lower visual field right around the mouth, which is exactly where the interesting information is coming from: your mouth, your face, your expression. When a dog tilts its head, it moves the muzzle out of the way. It's not an emotional gesture first, it's an engineering fix. Move the obstruction, get a clearer look at the source. Your dog isn't performing confusion for your benefit. It's making a small physical adjustment so it can actually see your mouth move while you talk, because your mouth moving while sound comes out is itself a piece of information. And dogs, it turns out, pay very close attention to that. Now here's where it gets more interesting, because sound alone doesn't explain the whole picture. Dogs are extraordinary at locating where a sound is coming from. Their hearing range extends far beyond ours, upward of 45,000 hertz compared to our roughly 20,000, and their ears, especially in breeds where the ears are still mobile, can rotate independently of each other, like little satellite dishes constantly re-aiming toward whatever noise just happened. A dog's brain calculates the location of a sound using minute differences in the time it takes that sound to reach each ear, milliseconds apart, differences so small you'd never consciously register them, and the dog's auditory system was built specifically to catch them. So when you talk, your dog isn't just hearing noise, it is actively triangulating you. And a tilt of the head changes the geometry of that triangulation. It shifts the ears relative to each other and relative to the sound source, refining the calculation, like adjusting an antenna a few degrees to pull in a clearer signal. Your dog tilting its head is not confusion, it is calibration. But calibration alone doesn't explain why it happens more with certain words, more with certain tones, more frankly, when you're talking directly to your dog with that specific voice people use exclusively for pets and infants. The one that gets embarrassingly high-pitched without your permission. And this is where the emotional layer comes back in, because it turns out the head tilt is strongly correlated with attentiveness and engagement, not just acoustic troubleshooting. A study conducted by researchers at the Family Dog Project in Hungary, one of the more respected research groups studying dog cognition, found something remarkable when they tracked head-tilting behavior in dogs during word recognition tasks. Dogs that reliably recognized specific object names, dogs that had learned actual vocabulary, meaning they could correctly retrieve a specific toy when asked for it by name, tilted their heads significantly more often when hearing those known words than dogs who hadn't learned any object names at all. The head tilt, in other words, showed up disproportionately in the dogs that understood more, not less. This flips the popular assumption completely on its head, pun regrettably intended. We tend to read the tilt as, I don't understand you. The research suggests it might actually be closer to, I recognize this and I am concentrating. It's not the blank stare of confusion, it's the leaning in of comprehension. Somewhere between the muzzle clearing mechanical function and the full emotional experience of hearing a beloved voice. There's this middle layer where the tilt becomes almost a marker of focus, a visible sign that a word just landed somewhere meaningful in the dog's memory. Let's sit with that family dog project result a little longer, because it's genuinely one of the more elegant findings in modern animal cognition research. The team worked primarily with a small number of exceptional dogs, border collies among them, dogs known for unusually large vocabularies of object names, sometimes upward of 100 distinct toy names memorized and correctly retrieved on command. And what they found wasn't just that tilting correlated with known words. It correlated specifically with the moment of retrieval, the instant right after the word was spoken, and right before the dog moved to fetch the correct object. That's not a random tick. That's a snapshot of active recall happening in real time, visible from the outside, written across the dog's neck muscles. Imagine being able to watch a human brain in the half second between hearing a name and remembering the face that goes with it. The head tilt might be the closest thing we have to seeing that process from the outside in a dog. Now let's talk about the ears specifically, because there's a structural piece of this that rarely gets mentioned, and it deserves more attention than it gets. Dogs' outer ears, the visible flap called the pinna, function partly like a satellite dish, funneling sound down into the ear canal. Breeds with upright ears, like German Shepherds or Huskies, have significantly more independent control over where that dish points than breeds with heavy floppy ears, like Basset Hounds or Spaniels. And researchers studying the head tilt behavior across breeds have noticed something intuitive once you think about it. Dogs with floppier, heavier ears tend to tilt their heads more frequently and more dramatically than dogs with upright ears. Why? Because a floppy ear can't rotate on its own to chase a sound. If your ears are essentially two soft flaps of skin hanging beside your face instead of two mobile radar dishes, the only way to reposition them relative to a sound source is to move the entire head. The tilt becomes a workaround. A Basset Hound isn't more curious than a German Shepherd. A Basset Hound just has worse ear mobility and has to compensate with more head movement to get the same acoustic information. This is worth sitting with for a second because it means the same behavior, the exact same head tilt that melts your heart, can have a partially different cause depending entirely on the shape of the dog doing it. For a floppy-eared breed, it might be mostly mechanical necessity. For a prick-eared breed, whose ears can already independently swivel toward a sound without any head movement at all, a tilt is less structurally necessary, which means when those dogs do tilt, it's more likely to be driven by something closer to the engagement and recognition signal we talked about earlier, rather than simple acoustic compensation. Same gesture, different dogs, different blend of reasons underneath. There's also a visual component that almost never gets mentioned, and it might be the most underrated piece of the whole puzzle. Dogs rely heavily on human facial expressions, more than most people realize. Research on canine cognition has repeatedly shown that dogs are remarkably attuned to subtle shifts in human faces, more attuned, in some measured respects, than many other non-human animals studied, including some primates. A dog watching your face while you speak isn't just hearing your words. It's cross-referencing your tone against your expression, checking whether your mouth is smiling, whether your eyebrows are doing something, whether the whole picture matches the sound coming out. And a dog's muzzle, positioned exactly where it is, partially blocks the lower half of its own visual field when its head is held level and facing straight forward. Tilting the head doesn't just adjust hearing, it adjusts sightline. It gives the dog an unobstructed look at your mouth and the muscles around it at exactly the moment those muscles are moving and producing meaningful sound. The tilt is doing two jobs simultaneously, recalibrating the ears and clearing the visual path to your face. It's a multitasking gesture disguised as an adorable quirk. Let's talk about timing now, because that matters too. And this is where individual personality starts, entering the picture. The tilt tends to show up most reliably with certain triggers. A rising, questioning tone of voice, the specific high-pitched register humans unconsciously switch into around dogs and babies, Unfamiliar words mixed into familiar sentences and sudden or unexpected sounds breaking a pattern the dog had settled into. It's essentially triggered by novelty layered on top of attention. A completely predictable monotone sentence rarely produces it. But say something with rising pitch, something slightly unusual, something that breaks the auditory pattern the dog was expecting, and the tilt appears almost instantly, like a reflex wired directly into curiosity itself. Now for the myth worth addressing directly, because it's the one that gets repeated the most and deserves to be corrected properly. The head tilt does not mean your dog is stupid, confused, or lost. If anything, the opposite is closer to true. Dogs that tilt their heads more frequently in structured cognitive testing environments have, in several studies, shown stronger performance on tasks requiring sound discrimination and object word association. The tilt is not evidence of a struggling brain. It's closer to visible evidence of an engaged one, which reframes the entire behavior. Every time your dog tilts its head at you, it isn't broadcasting confusion. It's broadcasting effort. It is doing something actively in real time to understand you better. And very few animals extend that kind of effort toward decoding a completely different species communication system on a daily basis, for no reward beyond your approval and maybe a treat. Here's the part that tends to land hardest, though, and it ties everything back together. Wolves, the closest living wild relative to domestic dogs, tilt their heads far less frequently than dogs do, and almost never in response to human speech specifically, for the obvious reason that wolves haven't spent 15 to 40,000 years living embedded inside human households, listening to human voices as their primary environmental soundtrack from birth. The head tilt, or at least the frequency and context in which dogs perform it toward humans, appears to be something that intensified specifically through domestication. Dogs living closely with humans for hundreds of generations were, whether deliberately or not, selected for exactly this kind of responsiveness. Dogs that engaged more with human vocal cues, that appeared more attentive, that seemed like they were trying harder to understand, were the dogs humans kept close, fed, bred, and kept as companions generation after generation. The head tilt may not be a universal canine trait so much as a co-evolved one. Something dogs developed, consciously or not, alongside us because it worked. Because it kept the relationship going. Because a dog that looks like it's trying to understand you gets more attention, more affection, more of everything a dog actually wants. Which means, when your dog tilts its head at you mid-sentence, you're watching something that is simultaneously mechanical, cognitive, and deeply relational, all layered on top of each other in a single 2-second gesture. The muzzle clearing out of the way so the ears can recalibrate. The independent ear structure trying to retriangulate a sound. The visual system clearing a sight line to your mouth. The brain cross-referencing tone against known vocabulary, checking whether this is a word it's heard before, whether a toy or a walk or a treat is about to be mentioned. And underneath every layer of that, thousands of generations of an animal that specifically evolved alongside us to look like it's trying its hardest to understand the strange sounds coming out of the strange, mostly hairless creature it decided, a very long time ago, was worth listening to. So the next time you're talking to your dog, saying something completely ordinary, and that head tilts to one side, ears up, eyes locked onto your face like the rest of the world just stop mattering, know what you're actually looking at. Not confusion, not an accident of anatomy, effort, focus, recognition. Thousands of years of an animal choosing, over and over again, generation after generation, to try a little harder to understand you than it strictly needed to. That's not your dog being confused by you. That's your dog working to know you. And it's been doing that, in some form, since before either of you had any idea it would end up mattering this much.